Welcome to Lethal Dose, your favorite toxicology-focused podcast where we delve into true crime cases involving drugs and poisons. My name is Venus Dineko. I'm a layperson fascinated by true crime.
My name is Kayla Woods. I'm an author and toxicologist.
Let's get started. Welcome to Mercury Part 2. So in Mercury Part 1, we talked about Minamata disease, which came from the Chiso fertilizer plant dumping chemicals into Minamata Bay, unfortunately. And it began with the dancing cats that were wobbly and ran themselves into the ocean, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, they
and
fell
drowned
into
themselves.
the ocean.
Very sad. Very fucking sad. But then it started spreading to the people in Minamata. And it was a bunch of neurological symptoms, right? They were having issues walking correctly. They had tunnel vision. What were some of the other ones? Headaches.
Psychosis, paralysis, coma.
Yeah, losing motor function, uncontrollably salivating. And some of the people lived for weeks, unfortunately, and some people lived with it for years, right?
Yes. Yeah. And then there was the miscarriages, the stillbirths, and then the congenital Minamata disease. And that manifested... that one was really weird because, the mothers didn't tend to exhibit Minamata.
That's because the fetuses sucked all up all the mercury, right?
Basically.
Yeah.
And so these babies were born with intellectual disabilities. They had, poor coordination. Their limbs could be deformed. They had poor reflexes and impaired growth. And so all of this was from methyl mercury poisoning. So methyl mercury poisoning, even if it's not centralized to Japan, is now known as Minamata disease. This was just the first outbreak that we saw. There was another location in Japan as well, in Niigata, that they had another corporation who was also dumping. But dumping from Chiso began in the 30s. The disease didn't present until the 50s. The company wasn't held liable until the 70s. Minamata Bay was closed in 1974 to fishing, and then it was reopened in 1997. And so this episode, we're going to kind of go back and forth a lot in history, but that whole reopening of the bay in 1997 and the consideration of mercury in the 90s based on what happened in Minamata and based on looking at the victims of congenital Minamata disease, growing up and kind of seeing what that longitudinal effect looked like, that's going to play a really big role in today's episode.
All right. Let's get started with today's. Where are we going today?
Wow. In 1998, a year after the bay was reopened, came the infamous Wakefield article. And so right now, it has nothing to do with mercury, but it will get there, I promise. So Andrew Wakefield was a trainee gastrointestinal surgeon in the UK. And his 1998 paper was published in the highly respected and long-standing English medical journal, The Lancet. And he actually published it with 11 other people. And this paper was examining a possible link between colitis and autism. And this is actually a link that is worth studying because there is some sort of gastrointestinal link, they think, between autism spectrum disorder and maybe any number of bowel diseases. They look at autism and IBD now. It is a link worth looking at. But this paper was fraudulent. It was determined to be completely fraudulent.
No.
And eventually, 10 of the researchers would retract their position on this paper, while Wakefield and the others were banned from practicing medicine as a result of publishing this fraudulent paper in The Lancet.
But that's not where it ends. The impact is huge.
The impact is huge. It's huge. So what they did, what this article originally said when it was allowed to be published, they said they took 12 children for their research.
A huge number, by the way.
Yeah, that's a great sample size.
Yeah.
And it's also super great that they were children who were picked by their parents to be in the study. And, like, of course you want to have children looked at who are being impacted by certain things, but it's like this handpicking of things by parents is not great. And it gets worse than that, actually. But so, according to these children's parents or their physicians, they had behavioral problems which prompted a suspicion of autism after these children were first vaccinated with the MMR vaccine, which is measles, mumps, and rubella. So the team on this fraudulent paper concluded that the correlation they found in 8 children selected by their parents showed a causative link between the onset of autism and the vaccine. And Wakefield therefore called for the MMR vaccine to be suspended.
All because of 8 kids.
8 kids, yes.
All because of 8 kids, we need to get rid of this vaccine wholly.
Yes, we need to suspend it, and we need to find something that is safer that doesn't cause autism, according to him.
Right.
Now, within a month, the controversy over this paper was widespread. As it turned out, these children were not just self-selected for the study by their parents, they were on a list created by a law firm that was suing MMR manufacturers, and Wakefield himself was paid £50,000 for the study. None of this was declared on the paper in his, by financial interests. And it would only be revealed in medical review boards because of the investigative journalism of Brian Deere at the Sunday Times of London and Channel 4 television.
So all because of this one guy.
Yes. Yeah. And normally you're supposed to declare a bunch of stuff. You're supposed to declare any interests that you have.
Well, and any funding you get for it.
And any funding that you get. And the fact that this guy had to dig meant that they were definitely trying to cover their tracks. And they were trying to cover their tracks so bad because Deere discovered that the patent that Wakefield and the Royal Free Hospital School of Medicine filed for a new vaccine was a competitor to the current MMR vaccine that they were saying should be suspended.
Yeah, that is a huge bias that
should be
is
declared.
Unacceptable. Yeah, well, should be declared and is kind of unacceptable.
That's why it was called fraudulent. This isn't just me saying it's fraudulent. Eventually, they did have a whole, there was a review board, and he had his, license to practice medicine suspended. And what's worse is that with this new vaccine that they were creating, they were saying it could be administered to neonates and sufferers of IBD as a complete cure.
No.
So all of it is just lies. Lies on top of lies on top of lies.
Right.
And, of course, much of the data in the study was faked. So the link between autism and colitis was completely faked. The behavioral problems reported by parents came before the children were vaccinated, but the study claimed that they all experienced symptoms within a week or so of getting the jab, and so they're lying about the timeline. The link Wakefield was pretending to find was between bowel issues and regressive autism specifically, meaning that the children had normal development until a point, and then had a noticeable decline with autism features as described in the DSM. But out of the 12 children examined, only one of them had regressive autism, and that was the specific thing he was saying was
the
being caused.
Point. Yeah, was the point of this.
And 3 of them didn't have any form of autism. So
Okay.
The real unfortunate thing about this is that the information revealed by Deere and everybody else didn't become as widespread as the fear-mongering Wakefield and his team are guilty of. Deere's reporting didn't come until 2004.
Oh, no. So that's 6 years that this study just kind of when did it become fraudulent? Or when did they find the paper fraudulent?
I mean, pretty immediately, other researchers in the field were like, I don't
But the
think
damage
that's
was
true.
done.
The damage was done, and the Lancet didn't retract the article for 12 years.
Oh, no.
So for 12 years, it was just out there. And, I mean, people still believe a lot of this, and we're going to get into that. You and I have a mutual friend who, when she got pregnant, was asking me about vaccines and asking about this specifically. And I had to be like, no, that's fraudulent. I know it was out for 12 years, and it was cited by people and shit, but...
And people always go back to this paper when they talk about this topic.
They do. They do because people, even though like it has been revealed by Brian Deere and other people that like it was lies and it was based on financial gain, they're still like, no, no, no. Wakefield is he was trying to uncover the truth. And it's because Andrew Wakefield is still like active in the anti-vax movement. So he's still out there spouting his bullshit. But so 3 months after the retraction in The Lancet, so 12 years after the publication, the 3-year-long hearing from the UK General Medical Council ended and removed Wakefield from the medical register. So he was still practicing for another 12 years and wasn't investigated for 9 after the publication. But this did end his career as a physician. He cannot practice medicine anymore.
But people still want to use him.
They still want to use him because they think he's speaking the truth, right? That big pharma doesn't want you to know.
And I'm sure that for the conspiracy theorists, they're just like, no, they're trying to quiet this beautiful man.
Yes. Such a beautiful mind this man has, yeah.
Okay.
The MMR vaccine didn't have any mercury. But it almost makes sense that the community of parents of autistic children directed their ire towards any ingredient in vaccines following this, especially within that 12-year period before it was retracted. And especially mercury being an ingredient, given the convergence of circumstances in the 1990s. Mm-hmm. But before we talk about all that, we have to go back in time again. Okay. So we have to go back before Wakefield, and we have to talk about the history of autism diagnoses and treatments, which is a warning, involves discussion of medical mistreatment and Nazi ideology. So autistic people, or people whom professionals would identify as having autistic traits, have been around as long as allistic people. Early descriptions of individuals who are likely autistic date reliably back to the early 18th century. But the term autistic was first used in 1911 by German psychiatrist Eugene Bleuler. Bleuler had also coined the term schizophrenia and was using autism to describe the most severe cases of schizophrenia. The word autism was Bleuler actually referencing Freud's term autoeroticism. And this was first used in 1905 to describe the behavior of a child who self-soothed with hallucinations rather than engaging with reality.
Well, that's different than what I understood it to be.
Right, because it's changed so much. And so this is how it started.
Gotcha.
Autism also meant that the child had a weak nervous system that forced them to lose touch with reality and fail to have a sense of self. These descriptions were similar also to the Freudian term psychotic, meaning experiencing hallucinatory confusion that dominated reality. So they're calling these children like psychotic, schizophrenic. That's where autism started. And in Britain, there were some very influential practitioners who believed that infants and children needed to be diagnosed as schizophrenic, psychotic, or autistic more often because it meant that children would receive more treatment, as this was around the time of the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913 that ensured institutional care for all children identified as mental defectives. But this, of course, was not in the children's interest. This was to take those children from the homes of caregivers who didn't think they could handle it and put them in an institution. But so we are now looking for children. We are trying to diagnose them with autism, schizophrenia, psychosis, even infants, so that we can put them in these institutions. It's not great. It's not a good start.
Yeah, that's not lovely at all.
So in this way, autism was early on a mental illness that was used more to alleviate the burden of an afflicted child from their caregiver.
Than to find a solution to the problem.
Right. Than to say, oh, you have this set of symptoms that you have. So here's a set of treatments or a set of things that we think can help, or even a community that you can turn to. It was not that whatsoever.
Right.
Not unlike almost all mental illnesses at the time, though. But this is kind of a pattern that did continue throughout the history of the term autism. So in the 1940s, theories about refrigerator mothers causing maternal deprivation.
What's a refrigerator mother?
Cold mothers.
Mothers. Okay.
Yeah, they have no emotion.
Gotcha.
And so they were blaming refrigerator mothers for a lot of things. It was very Freudian to blame your mother. And so they were saying that these mothers made it so their children had an inability to have a sense of self or capacity for relationships. So, entirely on the mother that you are hallucinating and you can't relate to other people. And I think this is an unfair way of looking at the mother-child relationship, since many of the children examined during this time were self-selected by psychiatrist parents who maybe were looking at their kids as more of like experiments than children. Or, even worse, they were children evacuated from their cities during World War II. And so now they're looking at these children and they're like, oh, well, your mother must not have hugged you. And it's like, my mother died in the bombing.
Yeah, she couldn't hug me. Thank
Yeah.
you for that, though.
Yet, Anna Freud agreed that environmental factors and relationships could impact an infant as young as 6 months. This is how early we're looking to diagnose them. And that these relationships could cause them to develop a form of psychopathology, reverting back to a state of narcissism and autoeroticism that she considered the autistic state all children are born into. So they're expecting you to be narcissistic and autoerotic up to 6 months, and then you should develop past that, which I don't know a lot about babies, but that seems like a very fast timeline.
Yeah, 6 months. Like, I mean, they're like barely holding their heads up at that point.
Yeah, can they even like register that they have feet by 6 months?
Right, right.
Yeah. But possibly Anna Freud was looking at the wrong environmental factor, given the place, time, and mental state of caregivers, right? So they're just like kind of trying to look at things.
Like, we're just trying to get through the war here.
Yeah, just trying to survive out here. And so it was from these theories that Leo Kanner developed what he believed was a unique psychological disorder in children, an inborn autistic disturbance of affective contact. The children whose cases he cited for his definition had good relation to objects, especially if they retain their sameness and never threaten to interfere with the child's aloneness. So you can kind of see how it's like kind of veering towards like how we view autism today, but it's not there yet. He said that these children had poor relationships with people. They rarely noticed if another person entered the room, used language very literally, and failed to relate to other people physically. Although the term autism had already been around for some 30 years, this was considered the first official description. And although it was still strongly associated with schizophrenia, it basically summarized children who couldn't interact with their external environment. And so this is the direction that it continued to go. Austrian children, whose caregivers could not deal with their behavior on their own, were sometimes sent to the Therapeutic Pedagogy Ward at the Vienna University Children's Clinic. Established in 1911 to treat patients with psychopathy or mental imbalance, which eventually became just another cog in the Nazi war machine. So this is where we're going now.
Okay. Buckling up.
Hans Asperger joined in May of 1931 and became the director from 1946 to 1949, and then again from 1962 until he retired in 1977. Despite the fact that he had been a Nazi in everything but name during the Third Reich. So between 1949 and 62, I don't know what he was doing, but they were like, why don't you come be our director again? Like, we'll kind of just sweep that Nazi shit under the rug.
Yeah, we'll pretend that you weren't a Nazi for the last 15 years.
Yeah.
Cool.
He submitted child patients to the Health Office's Department of Heredity and Racial Care for sterilization for genetic conditions.
Ugh.
Or had children considered abnormal and uneducable sent to a euthanasia facility.
What?
Yes, there was an entire facility.
Like that's just euthanizing kids.
Yes, yeah, and they didn't call it that, but that's definitely what it was.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. He was also blind, like his predecessors, to the environmental impacts on the mental health of children he considered other. He, in one case, diagnosed a Jewish teenager with severe psychopathy with particular sensitivity and paranoid irritability after this teenager was forced to listen to a speech from Hitler in 1938.
Walter is much more disagreeable than 3 weeks ago when he was last here. During Hitler's speech, he put his head into his hands on the table and stared into a void. He was very agitated. When a child broke out in cheers, he opened his eyes wide and turned pale. I think that's a reasonable reaction for a Jewish kid listening to Hitler. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I don't think this kid was psychopathic in any way. I think he was pretty normal.
No, I think that's totally reasonable.
Yeah. And although Asperger described a genetic link to autism, which, we've established now, he did so in the same way that Lombroso linked criminality to genetics. Do you remember this Lombroso guy?
I don't remember him specifically, but I do know like of this topic.
Well, we talked about this guy specifically in episode 2. So arsenic part 1, sex, drugs, and
Oh.
witchcraft. Yes.
Oh, oh, yes, yes. I do know who you're talking about now.
Yeah.
He was the guy who gave the female form to or the female form to criminality, like.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
And
Yes, yes,
so
yes.
basically in the same way that Lombroso was like you can tell if a woman is going to be evil, Asperger was like you can tell if a kid is going to be like fucked up or autistic or something. And it was mostly just him being like, well, he's Jewish, so obviously.
Obviously.
That
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Oh my God. Okay.
And so his genetic link was kind of overlooked because it was Nazi science. And so the psychoanalytic view of autism didn't give way to a biological view as we know it now until around 1965. This is also when autism diagnoses began to differ from schizophrenia, and eventually the model of psychosis was eliminated from the diagnosis.
Okay. So we
But
kept that specifically to schizophrenia,
yes.
and now we're category. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. So now they were examining children already deemed autistic and then looking at their behavior, and they were able to create a criterion based on behavior. So these two ideas, that there was a biological root with a criterion based on behavior, those gave the first major rise in autism diagnoses in the early 1970s. So there had been other rises, like I said before, like in the early 1910s, but this was like a major spike that we got in the 1970s because our criteria had changed.
Okay.
But it's also important to note that there were two factions of people who agreed that autism is linked to biology. The mainstream belief is that autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, has little to do with parental behavior, so it doesn't really matter if like your mom was around or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on genetics, and it presents as a spectrum disorder, and it cannot be cured, but only rehabilitated. And I don't know if I like the word rehabilitated, but
I
it can only
don't.
be supported, right?
Yeah, because rehabilitation implies to me that there is a problem.
Yeah,
Yeah, that needs to be fixed.
right. No,
I think
it can,
supported is a better
yeah,
term.
but it can't be cured. And from this faction came the Society for Autistic Children, which built schools exclusively for children with autism. And they believed all of them to be educable. So Asperger's whole thing where he was like, oh, you can't teach
Can't
these
teach
kids
these
anything.
kids. Yeah.
No, they were like, they're just autistic. They just have to be supported in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
This set of beliefs actually caused another influx in diagnoses because autistic children were now being looked for in screenings so they could be given the support that they needed. On the other side of this biology idea, though, is the minority. And the minority group believed that autism is a biomedical condition caused by a host of different things that can cause people to present in one autistic way. And because it is something that can be pinpointed, they think it can be cured. And so now we've kind of come to the triple point of our story. So I want everyone listening to imagine that you are a parent in the early 90s. And maybe you were a parent in the early 90s, but just imagine with me.
Most of our audience probably wasn't because they were like born in the 90s, but
As I was. So we're parents in the early 90s. Our child has just been diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which we don't call it now in 2024, but it had just been introduced to the DSM-4 in 1994. And maybe you did or didn't suspect that your kid maybe was on the spectrum. But either way, now you have the diagnosis. But a bunch of their classmates were also diagnosed, way more than in your class or your parents' classes. So now instead of getting the services that your child needs, they're put on a waiting list. You, as a good parent, want to support your kid the best way you can now that you have this diagnosis, and you want something you can go on until you get that professional support. So what do? You go on the internet, because it's the 90s, right?
mm-hmm.
And the internet is a big, new, weird, shiny thing that we have. You find forums for other parents who have children with autism. And here you find that there is some research into causes of autism, which range from genetics to abnormalities in intestinal permeability. If all you have is what lies in front of you, because once again, it's the early 90s with the internet, and I, Kayla Woods, am a baby, and podcasts don't exist yet, and I can't tell you all of the information we have in 2024. All you're seeing is that a lot of kids in your child's age group suddenly have autism, and
Right.
no one seems to know why. But there are professionals engaging parents in reputable organizations and at conferences, and the parents are kind of on the same level as these researchers in terms of like being respected at these conferences and talking at these conferences. And so you kind of feel like you're on the same level. And so you think, as a parent, I have a pretty good grasp on things. I know what it's like to have an autistic child. And I've been doing my reading and I've been engaging with the community. And what I see is that there is an epidemic of autism. And we need to find the source of it and tamp it out. And I don't know that that's necessarily even the best way to look at it, because if you had a child with congenital Minamata, I can understand saying, like, I don't want anybody else to experience congenital Minamata. Right. I don't want anybody else to have the financial support required to raise a child this way, or the emotional toll that it takes to raise a child who is struggling. But at the same time, it feels very centered on the caregiver, and caregivers should totally have their space, to talk about the difficulties that they experience. But in these conversations, it rarely feels to me like the autistic child is ever actually centered.
No, it seems like it's centered around the parent.
Yeah. And
the difficulties of being a parent, not the difficulties of being an autistic child.
Right. And in that way, it kind of seems like it really sounds like they are describing their children as more of burdens than anything.
Right.
And I'm child-free because I do think of kids as burdens, but when you have one, like, I don't know, I really don't like the way that autism is described, especially amongst parents who I've seen discuss it, It feels icky.
It's pretty icky.
Way.
Yeah, that's the exact word that I...
But so, how did Mercury get wrapped up into all of this, right? Aside from, like sure, it was in vaccines at the time, and we did have the MMR thing, but who would have known that? Like, who was actually, like, looking at their flu vaccine and being like, oh, shit, what is this? So there were 2 longitudinal studies conducted in the 80s regarding methylmercury. This was following the closure of Minamata Bay, and so they wanted to study possible neurological injury to fetuses exposed to methylmercury in fish. And they did one of these studies in Seychelles and the other in the Faroe Islands. So both have very high rates of fish consumption.
Mm-hmm.
Based on these studies, environmental agencies adjusted their recommendations for fish consumption for adults and pregnant individuals in the 90s. So now you're having these policy changes that are drawing attention.
So this is when the Don't Eat Fish While You're Pregnant comes up.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Based on data gathered in Iraq on women and children, the EPA lowered its recommendation to 0.1 micrograms per kilogram of body weight in 1994. The Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry did the same thing, but then they raised theirs back up to 0.3 micrograms per kilogram in 1999. And this confused people. Like, it was not good to be doing all these policy changes and have different numbers.
Right.
But whatever the recommendation, there were a couple of constants with the numbers, even if they were different. These were numbers for adults, and children were just known to implicitly have lower tolerances, right?
They're tiny.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense.
The numbers were for methylmercury specifically, and the fear that everybody had for exceeding these recommendations was the manifestation of Minamata disease specifically. So it was all kind of specific. In 1997, the FDA Modernization Act gave the FDA 2 years to compile a list of drugs and foods that contain intentionally introduced mercury compounds and provide a quantitative and qualitative analysis of the mercury compounds on the list, which makes sense if we're in this culture of looking at mercury because we're concerned about Minamata disease.
Sure.
So the following year, Wakefield publishes his article, and the year after that, the FDA produced their list as ordered, as well as a report about mercury exposure from items on the list. They found that by the time a U.S. infant was 6 months old, they could receive as much as 75 micrograms of mercury in each of the 3 doses of the Tdap vaccine, 75 micrograms from the Hib vaccine, and 37.5 micrograms in each of the 3 doses of the Hep B vaccine. Altogether, this is 187.5 micrograms in the first 6 months of your life. But, of course, we want to look at it daily, because if we look at the numbers before for adults, that's daily. But on a day where a child receives, say, a single dose of the Tdap or Hib vaccine, this exceeds the recommended amount for mercury in fish by adult body weight by 100 times. Yeah.
Okay. So why was there mercury in these vaccines?
Ironically, there was mercury in the vaccines as a safety precaution initially.
Okay. Explain.
Well, so it's kind of extreme to inject anything into yourself or another person, right? And you have to be careful when you do it because you can very easily introduce bacteria and other toxins directly into the body that way. So it was a big deal at the beginning of the 20th century because during this time, things weren't always super hygienic with storage, and hypodermic needles were still kind of new, right? We're still trying to figure out how to make those safe. In 1916, a batch of typhoid vaccine that was tainted with some sort of growth was stored at room temperature in South Carolina. So the growth proliferated and 4 people died. And then in 1928, 12 Queensland children died of staph infections and toxemia from a contaminated diphtheria vaccine. And in both cases, the vaccines were drawn from multi-dose vials. So you would
Meaning,
use
like, it goes, you, like, use the same vial for multiple injections, like, on different people.
on different people with different needles, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
But it means that, maybe you stab the needle in and there was something on that needle. So now if you stab in again,
you get whatever was on there.
yeah. So antiseptics were added to vaccine formulas to prevent these kinds of outbreaks. And organomercurials were investigated for exactly these properties because we were still some 30 years out from discovering the first symptoms of Minamata disease. Eli Lilly and Company first patented the organomercurial Thimerosal in 1928 under the trade name Rethiolate. It was a white powder, approximately 50% mercury by weight, and was found to be 40 to 50 times more effective than the leading antiseptic phenol in fighting the staph virus. So that's great. Even better, when 300 rabbits were injected with thimerosal at concentrations of 20 milligrams per kilogram body weight, they seemed fine. Human studies were also conducted with ethical questionability in 1929 when 22 meningitis patients were given 180 milliliters of a 1% thimerosal solution over 5 doses and tolerated it well. But they did have meningitis and they died pretty soon thereafter. So
it's hard to say
yeah.
chicken or the egg.
Yeah. Thimerosal metabolizes into ethyl mercury, which is a form of organic mercury, but it's not the same as the methyl mercury found in fish.
Gotcha. Okay.
Methyl mercury is to ethyl mercury, as the methanol that makes you go blind is to the ethanol you consume on the weekends for fun.
It's all that little M. That little M makes all the difference.
Mary eats peanut butter. Gotta remember it. But that is not to say that the difference in biological impact is the same as between ethanol and methanol, right? It's just the difference in chemistry is the same. But it's an important difference. Ethyl mercury does behave similarly to methyl mercury on a cellular level, meaning that it can pass through the blood-brain barrier and it still binds to specific proteins and destroys them. But ethyl mercury is eliminated from the body 3 times faster than methyl mercury, so it's much less likely to bioaccumulate, and the impact of ethyl mercury on the kidneys and brain tissues is far less pronounced.
Okay.
And now, I'm not trying to make an argument in favor of mercury, by any means. I'm just saying that we didn't have all of the information that we needed to make an appropriate assessment. And that's also what the FDA was saying back in 1999 when they had their list and they were reporting on it.
Mm-hmm.
They were like, we don't know if we have all the information, but we do have these numbers and they don't look great. So, in June of 1999, FDA scientists held a meeting to discuss their findings with the CDC and the American Academy of Pediatrics to decide what was best for children in regards to these vaccines. Ultimately, they decided to proceed with caution, since methylmercury is a big deal, and so its sister could be also. And they asked pharmaceutical companies to remove thimerosal from vaccines following this meeting. They also asked doctors to delay the birth dose of the hepatitis B vaccine in kids who were not at particular risk of hepatitis B.
Just to eliminate more exposure to the mercury in the vaccines, or
Yeah.
the ethyl mercury.
Yeah, because this was one of the first ones you could get, and so they wanted to have it on hand for if, like, the mother had hepatitis B and they needed to give it to the infant. But they were like, let's hold out on some of the other ones. We're going to reformulate these, but in the meantime, like, we're just going to proceed with caution.
Gotcha.
But this policy change was not rolled out effectively, and people freaked the fuck out about it.
I get it. I get it. Like when they're like, oh, this wasn't safe. And then like, but what about my children who already got the 100+ micrograms of ethyl mercury in their vaccines? Like
There was that. But they didn't say it's not safe. I think their statement was something like, we are proceeding with caution to make the vaccines, which are safe. They're safe vaccines. Nobody on record has died as a result of this that we can tell. We're just trying to make it safer. And parents and doctors were like, how are you trying to make it safer if it's already safe? And so both the parents and the doctors kind of assumed, like you were saying, that the thimerosal must have been removed because it was now known to be dangerous, and they're just not saying that.
right.
And so some hospitals just stopped administering the hepatitis B vaccine altogether to kids, regardless of their risk level.
Oh.
In at least one case, a 3-month-old in Michigan died from the hepatitis B virus they received from their mother at birth.
Ugh.
So things are not great. People are freaking out. By March of 2001, though, the vaccines with the highest concentrations of thimerosal all had FDA-approved alternatives that no longer contained thimerosal, which meant that no child under 6 years old in the United States was receiving any thimerosal-containing vaccine any longer. March of 2001, they did it in less than 2 years. Unfortunately, like the Wakefield article, the damage had been done. At least, unleashed Pandora's box style upon the world, never to be shoved back in again.
Right.
Beginning in 2000, several parent advocacy groups were founded on the belief that thimerosal caused their children to develop autism. So now the connection is kind of being established. Parents refused to vaccinate their children with the preparations of the flu vaccine that still contained thimerosal, even though the flu kills about 100 kids per year. And so they're saying, I would rather my kid be one of the 100 that dies than possibly get autism.
That is so fucking tragic to me.
And that's why I think where you and I are getting the ick is like, I know autistic people. Like, maybe they're not the high support autism that some of these people are talking about, but it's not a death sentence.
No, and it's like, it's like you would rather risk death than have your child be autistic. Like, what a fucking statement.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
And it says more about the parent.
It does. Yes, it does. So that same year, in 2000, the Institute of Medicine convened a public safety panel regarding vaccine safety, and in the review that followed, found no evidence of a relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism. Although, being scientists who are open to things changing and needing more information, they didn't rule out the possibility entirely that a subset of children could possibly be impacted. They were like, further studies are needed. But they found that the evidence on thimerosal was inadequate to accept or reject a causal relationship between the substance and autism. So they're looking into it and they're like, we haven't found anything yet, but we'll keep looking for you guys. The CDC continued further investigations of vaccine safety, which prompted parent backlash when their 2003 study of 140,000 children showed no relationship between autism and thimerosal. People were pissed about this for some reason.
They're pissed that something is safe? Like,
I know, right?
Like it's literally like they want to be outraged and they want to be upset.
I mean, it's probably not that it's safe. I'm sure the backlash is that, like, oh, you were lying to us and we know the truth. But it's like, but this is a massive study. Like,
Yeah.
N equals 140,000 is much better than N equals 12.
Yeah.
But public response was so severe that the agency had to report death threats they received to federal investigators. The following year, in 2004, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger banned thimerosal containing flu vaccines from that state, as if only politicians could protect their constituents from harmful chemicals, and the agencies responsible for handling the vaccines hadn't determined on principle to remove a substance that hadn't even proven to cause harm to anyone. Like, now it's being used as a political pawn. In an eighth and final report issued by the Institute of Medicine in 2004, the panel determined unanimously that their review of over 200 epidemiological and biological studies found no causal relationship between MMR or thimerosal and autism. There was no evidence of vaccine-induced autism, even in the small subset of children they were holding out on, and no demonstration of any potential biological mechanisms as suggested by parent groups or the doctors and congressmen who backed them. Unsurprisingly, the Institute came under fire from an online group called Parents Requesting Open Vaccine Education, or PROVE, which challenged scientists to prove definitively that vaccines don't cause autism. Yeah.
Okay.
PROVE declared that the Institute's panel was riddled with conflict of interests, and that the members were in a conspiracy to sweep a generation of children under the rug and maintain current vaccine policy at any and all costs.
Okay. Okay. Sure. What? You guys are weird.
Yeah, you guys, yeah. So our next antagonist, perhaps even villain in the story, enters in 2005. When Robert F. Kennedy Jr. published an article simultaneously in Rolling Stone and on Salon.com entitled Deadly Immunity. In it, Kennedy set the stage by asserting that a June 2000 meeting of the CDC, FDA, WHO, and top vaccine manufacturers was held in complete secrecy, and then centered the thimerosal autism discussion from actual researchers to support his theory that global health agencies colluded with Big Pharma to hide the risks of thimerosal from the public. But these researchers were not only quoted out of context, or they were fringe researchers who were in this discussion, they were misquoted. And this meeting did happen. There was a meeting between the CDC and the FDA and top vaccine manufacturers, but it wasn't in secret. He's like, oh, well, they held it out in the middle of nowhere near Atlanta. And it's like, yeah, because there was another, like, couple of conferences happening that year, and they couldn't get anywhere to rent, so they had to go. Like
it's not banal. Like they're trying. Yeah, exactly. It's a completely innocent reason. Like, yeah. Okay.
So, after receiving 5 corrections to obvious errors in the article from researchers in the community and people who wrote in, Salon pulled the article from their website 6 years later. Rolling Stone...
Once again, the damage is done.
I know. And Rolling Stone kept the article up with corrections and didn't really say anything about it. But then they pulled the article from their website in 2010, claiming that it went down mysteriously. But now it can't be found there. It's just gone.
Okay.
Kennedy kept the original article without correction up on his own website. So.
Okay.
But it's more than unfortunate that 2 large, reputable publications were once again used to spread an individual's propaganda. But that's exactly what happened here with Kennedy.
Right.
And RFK Jr. himself also appears to be a level-headed authority on the matter to at least some degree. For those of you who have no idea who this guy is, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the son of Senator Robert F. Kennedy. He's the nephew of JFK, and he's an environmental lawyer. He cites his experience with environmental law in this Deadly Immunity article to appear unbiased, and as somebody who was initially a skeptic about a supposed thimerosal autism link, but was then converted based on what he considers to be sound science. In it, he writes,
I was drawn into the controversy only reluctantly. As an attorney and environmentalist who has spent years working on issues of mercury toxicity, I frequently met mothers of autistic children who were absolutely convinced that their kids had been injured by vaccines. Privately, I was skeptical. I doubted that autism could be blamed on a single source, and I certainly understood the government's need to reassure parents that vaccinations are safe. The eradication of deadly childhood diseases depends on it. I tended to agree with skeptics, who criticize people for leaping to conclusions about autism and vaccinations. Why should we scare people about immunization until we know the facts?
Kennedy then goes on to say that reading the transcripts from the 2000 conference were what changed his mind on the matter. But Seth Noonkin has pointed out in Scientific American and on other forums that Kennedy misquoted people to manipulate what they said in the transcript, so I doubt that the conference changed his mind. RFK wrote the Deadly Immunity article following the publication of an anti-vax book called Evidence of Harm that dramatized a group of boys who exhibited autism around the time of their vaccinations. The author of this book and RFK went on a media circuit using RFK's celebrity and background to add merit to their claims that parents should fear vaccines.
But he's a lawyer, not a doctor.
No, he's not. Yeah.
Like, right.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
okay. So, okay. Just clearing that up.
Yeah, just going to throw that out there.
Just throwing that out there.
Kennedy wrote an entire book in 2014 entitled Thimerosal, Let the Science Speak, in which he claims to not be an anti-vaxxer and says that he is simply advocating for safer vaccines. Now, I bought a secondhand copy of this book, intending to figure out what Kennedy was saying exactly, and I was actually really struck by how verbose it is compared to the articles I was actually reading for research. Like, this book is over 400 pages long.
Ooh.
And it's structured in a very dry way. Every chapter is basically its own article, right? Addressing a specific concern. And that kind of told me that it's not a book for the typical person concerned about vaccines to read. It's not for parents to read. It's not a historical narrative or a narrative nonfiction in any way. It's a book to show that Kennedy has written a book and if I'm being completely honest.
You need to put that on the jacket.
I wrote a book.
This is a book to show that I wrote a book. Sorry. I'm sorry.
But more importantly, I think it's just a prop that anti-vaxxers
Right.
can tote with them and open it up to point out all the faults that they see in Thimerosal science.
Right.
And so for these reasons, I'm not going to actually dig deep into it like I initially thought I was going to, but I'll say a couple things about this book. First of all, Kennedy attempts to lend veracity to his claims by citing over 1,500 sources over the full length of the book. But not all of his citations actually back up the statements he makes, and sometimes they actually negate them.
Oh. Fantastic journalism,
Which,
sir.
I mean, it really is just like following the pattern that he and Wakefield and I'm sure other anti-vaxxers have of just lying. Like this, it's just lies.
Right.
And while the book makes several statements that are patently false, he does make one good point that I will give him. And that is that vaccines should be as safe as possible, and we should not rely on old, dubious science for safety guidelines. And maybe he's not making that argument in good faith, but if people read it and they pick up on that and they're maybe even coming into this episode saying like, hey, you know, maybe he said some shitty things, but I believe this, I totally agree. You know, we shouldn't be relying on Nazi science. We shouldn't be relying on a group
Right.
of meningitis patients who may or may not have survived their injections, you know?
I mean, and that's fair.
Yeah. But the thing is, nobody in the community disagrees with that.
Right. Like that's objectively fair that like vaccines should be safe. Like
Right. So you have the
you're not getting a gold star. Like this is not groundbreaking territory here.
No, the anti-vaxxers think that we don't give a shit what's in the vaccines, and the people who are pro-vaccine are like, no, they should be safe.
They should be safe.
Yeah.
Like I think we can all agree that they should be safe.
I mean, that was the whole reason the FDA originally looked at vaccines in the first place. They were like, oh shit, there's mercury in our vaccines. Like, it's ethyl mercury, but we should check that out.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time of this book's publication, by 2014, we already had a mountain of scientific research to show that thimerosal didn't cause autism, and we'd already eliminated thimerosal from nearly every vaccine in the US schedule. So his whole publication of this book,
2000 and late.
yeah, for real. 2000 and late. Nice. So yeah, I don't think he's making statements about vaccines in good faith. His arguments are intentionally misleading. And people on both sides of the vaccine argument point out conflicts of interests and monetary influence, as they should. Figure out who is influencing these people. If they're not announcing them, go ahead and dig into that. I think that's fine. But one of the ironies is that Wakefield did have undisclosed conflicts of interests, and that's kind of where this whole controversy has sprouted from. And so people are like, oh, well, the Institute of Medicine is just riddled with people who have like financial backers who are making them do this and whatever. And it's like Andrew
Wakefield did.
Yeah. He had his license suspended.
Because of how bad it was.
Yes.
Like that is a very severe punishment. Like that is not something that is handed down lightly. Like I think that is very important to note. Like
yeah.
If you're going to get your license suspended, like you royally fucked up.
You really fucked up. Yeah, and he did. I mean, he damaged the trust people had in medical institutions and research, and yeah, he fucked up. But so, let's look at Kennedy. So Kennedy's biases, I guess, is that he himself joined the Children's Health Defense in 2015 and is now the chairman of this group, which is an anti-vax advocacy group. He also uses his platform as a celebrity and as a lawyer to engage with people like Andrew Wakefield, and the two of them executive produced an anti-vax documentary together. So clearly his claims about being pro-vaccine and being concerned with safety aren't honest. He's also severely jeopardized public safety with his claims as well. Wakefield's legacy is that measles in 2000 had been declared eliminated, which is not the same as eradicated, but it's, we're getting there.
Eradicated means like completely gone, right?
Yes. Smallpox was eradicated.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
But in 2018, there were 220 measles cases in the U.S., and in 2019, there were 1,200 more.
Oh, shit.
2018 also had a particularly brutal flu season in the U.S. This might be Kennedy's legacy, that resulted in 80,000 deaths, many of them young children who were not vaccinated against medical recommendations. And in Europe, which was most negatively influenced by Andrew Wakefield's fraudulence, there were 53,000 cases of measles in the first 3 quarters of 2018, and these resulted in 40 deaths during that time period.
Shit. Yeah, because his publication was in the UK, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
I mean, it was available internationally. The Lancet was. I've used the Lancet for a couple of our episodes, but 1997, it was primarily being read in the UK, probably.
Right.
So nowadays, the only vaccines in the U.S. with thimerosal are the flu vaccines, and both of those, the quadrivalent and the trivalent, are also available in formulations without thimerosal because multi-dose vials are not often used in the U.S. We mostly get the single-dose vials.
Yeah, every time I've gotten a flu vaccine, it's like a single shot.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's in its own own little needle.
Yep, that's most common here. And so thimerosal is more often found in developing countries that are still using those multi-dose vials.
Gotcha.
And I think they're doing that because it's easier to store or it's easier to ship, something like that.
Okay.
Thimerosal is encountered so infrequently and at such low concentrations that experts maintain, as they always have, that the benefits of this mercuric preservative in vaccines have outweighed the risk of foregoing the vaccines altogether. For instance, this year, RSV has become a really big problem because of lack of vaccination. Immunization helps prevent hospitalization and death from diseases like this. And it's important for people who are at increased risks for these diseases, like infants, older adults, pregnant people, and people with underlying medical conditions. And these are the people that we're putting at risk by not vaccinating ourselves.
Right.
So 70 to 80% of American adults over 18 have at least one condition that puts them at a higher risk of a negative outcome.
Holy shit.
Yeah, it's a lot of people. And
yeah.
I don't know, if you look at the rates, they're like Vaccination is still in the low 90s for like measles and things like that. And like COVID had a 70% vaccination rate. And while those are high, we're talking about millions of people.
Right.
And so 4%, 30%, that's a lot of people.
That's a lot of people.
Yeah.
And that's putting a lot of people at risk, like even more people at risk.
Exactly. Exactly. But so let's dig into the more deadly toxicology that's behind thimerosal that people are so concerned about that they would rather die of COVID. Intentional overdose with thimerosal or excessive therapeutic application of thimerosal has resulted in poisonings, which is to say that we have data for acute exposure, but because it doesn't sit in the body for very long, I couldn't find any data for chronic exposure.
Got it. Oh, okay. Interesting.
So, for these acute exposures, in one instance, 6 cases of severe mercury poisoning were reported in the 1970s following an injection containing thimerosal as a preservative. But this was because a manufacturing error for the medicine caused vials to be produced that contained 510 milligrams of thimerosal rather than 0.51 milligrams of thimerosal.
Oh, fuck.
Yeah, not good.
Yeah, that's a huge error, but that's not, like, it wasn't supposed to be that way.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
the vaccine wasn't supposed to be that unsafe. It was an error.
Right.
But that's a pretty big error.
It's a pretty big error. Yeah. All 6 patients experienced tissue necrosis at the injection site. And these patients also experienced fever, altered mental status, slurred speech, and lack of muscle coordination. And 4 of them died.
Do we know if the other patients had prolonged symptoms, or was it like an acute attack of the symptoms?
I didn't see anything that talked about like a longitudinal, result or recovery or anything like that, so I can't say. I'm not sure. Thimerosal has also found many uses historically, from contact lens solution to diaper rinse. And so topical, ophthalmic, and oral toxicity has also been recorded. In these cases, after degradation into ethyl mercury, this will further degrade into inorganic mercury. Inorganic mercury poisoning manifests primarily with GI symptoms, tremors, and renal dysfunction, but can also produce the symptoms of neurasthenia and erythism, both of which are complex symptom presentations. Neurasthenia includes fatigue, depression, headaches, hypersensitivity to stimuli, psychosomatic complaints, weakness, and an inability to concentrate, while erythism is extreme shyness and blushing, which I've never heard of as a symptom before.
Interesting. I'm incredibly shy right now. Excuse me.
And anyone who's gotten this far in the episode believing that thimerosal and autism could still be linked or on the fence about it might hear all of those symptoms and say, that combination does sound similar in many ways to autism, the psychosomatic complaints, hypersensitivity to stimuli. I can see that. But the amounts of thimerosal needed to produce these kinds of symptoms is far greater than the amount in vaccines. And all of this is not what you get from intramuscular injections of thimerosal either. So,
right, because the route of exposure is always important.
Yeah. It does appear that a vocal minority do still believe that vaccines and autism are related. An article released in 2020 showed that approximately 1 in 6 caregivers of children with autism polled among a cohort in 2016 believed that there was a connection. Yeah. However, vaccine objection is still high overall, and Robert F. Kennedy is still on his bullshit. He has stated that the COVID-19 virus could have been ethnically targeted so that Ashkenazi Jews and Chinese people could not be infected.
What?
Full conspiracy theory.
Wow.
He denies this statement was anti-Semitic, but his
wife... my bullshit meter is going off the charts.
Yeah, for real. And his wife, cousin, and sister all disagree with him. His entire family is basically like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Yeah.
And this is mostly because his anti-vaccine stance is entirely in contradiction to part of JFK's legacy, which encouraged Americans to vaccinate their children against polio in 1961 And he signed the Vaccination Assistance Act in 1962 to make sure that all children were vaccinated. So, I don't know. It's weird to me that he's not using his platform to be so pro-vaccine when that would be so easy for him to do with that kind of
Right.
like family legacy. But
Legacy, yeah.
and much like his uncle before him, RFK has his eye on the presidency and is currently a Democratic candidate for the 2024 election, although he has received praise from both Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis.
Yuck.
So, so where are we now? Where are we now? I mean, safe vaccines are important, right? We shouldn't be relying on dubious science or limited information. But also, like, science changes. And I think that people are really uncomfortable with that. Like, they want to think that whatever they learned in the 7th grade about, like, rocks and clouds and whatever else you learn about in 7th grade is, like,
Right.
always going to be true. And so will everything else you learn in science. But that's just,
Things
like,
evolve, and science should always be evolving, like for
yeah.
the better. Like technology is always advancing, so therefore, like scientific findings are going to change.
Well, and like any scientific findings are going to be filtered through people. So you're going to end up with people
Right.
who don't
Interpret it
realize,
one way.
yeah, they don't realize that we're living through World War II and maybe that's going to fuck kids up a little bit, you know?
Right.
Or even if it's a harder science or something. I mean, they used to believe, so like molecules kind of wiggle a little bit, you know? And so
Mm-hmm.
if you have like H2O, like the two hydrogens will kind of wiggle on the oxygen. And they used to believe that molecules would be different depending on like how long that bond was, not realizing that
Mm.
things were wiggling. And so there used to be entire like studies into length of bonds when it's entirely irrelevant because you're basically just
Oh,
taking a picture of a molecule at its current state.
gotcha.
And so
Yeah,
like
things change.
yeah, things change and we have to be comfortable with things changing, but it's hard to accept things change when it comes to things like public health. And I get that, you know, because if you grew up believing that Epicac was totally cool and you should make yourself vomit if you get something inside of you, and then you and I are constantly being like, no, don't fucking
Don't.
do that.
Yeah, don't induce vomiting. Don't
Yeah.
induce the vomiting. It's not a good idea.
Yeah, you're gonna be like, so I just have to keep it in me? That's so much worse. And it's like, yeah, dude, go to the hospital. I'm sorry that that's like,
The
that's advice
answer.
now. Yeah.
Yeah, but like things change. Like
Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard to know like who's an objective source on this stuff too.
also fair.
I mean, especially when it's like you had Wakefield, who was being published in the Lancet, which is a peer-reviewed journal, and
I mean, right, like from the outside looking in like at that when that paper came out, like why would people object to it?
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean, I mean the sample size was like
I
pathetic.
know,
But
but
like I mean there are things that but like if you're not somebody who knows how to read medical journals, like and you just read the highlights and you go, "Oh my God."
right. Well, I mean, even if you do know how to read the medical journals, like it can be difficult. So like when I was doing research and I was like checking out everything that Kennedy was citing, I found a paper that he cited and it was about thimerosal toxicity and ethyl mercury toxicity and there's very very little information on that. I mean, I mostly cited Goldfrank's toxicological emergencies and there's not a whole lot beyond that I could find. And so when I saw this article, I was like, "Oh, Kennedy cited it, sure, whatever, but sometimes he cites things that negate him, so let's go see what it says."
Mhm.
And I happened to notice the author names were like Mark Geyer and David Geyer, and then a third person. And I was like, you know, I always notice when people have the same names, like in articles, I'm
Mhm.
like, are they like married?
Married?
Are
Are
they
they
brothers?
related?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I was reading through this article and I was like, wow, they have a lot of information I haven't seen anywhere else. I'll have to go like further look into their sources. But then they said that one of the instances of ethyl mercury poisoning was on grain in Iraq. And I stopped in my tracks because I was like, that was methyl mercury. That was
That's
a
not
methyl mercury instance.
that's not ethyl mercury.
Right. And I was like, I don't see any retractions on this paper. I don't see anything on like PubMed saying that this was corrected or this was addressed in any editorial way. It seemed like it was a pretty reputable journal from what I could tell.
Mm.
But I was like, this is wrong, and I don't think I can trust this. And then it turned out that father-son duo, they are pretty vehement anti-vaxxers, actually.
Mm,
They were mentioned in one of Seth Noonkin's articles that I read on Scientific
okay.
American. But it's like, I deep dived into this subject every evening for a month, and that's how I was able to pick it out. If I wasn't actually looking for something like that, and like
Right.
if I didn't know all of the
What you were looking
stories,
for, and you
yeah, and
didn't
if
know have all the pieces to the puzzle. Like,
then I would have just been like, oh, look at all this information. Why is nobody else talking about this? And I could have easily been misled, you know? So, yeah, I can imagine how difficult it must be to, see the paywalls on articles that are reputable and feel like you're just being left out of the conversation in some way. And then getting articles like this where you're like, oh, well, maybe Kennedy's right. Yeah. And I don't
but
know, you know.
all that being said, like, I just want to go back to that, like, these people who really feel that death is worse or is better
Yeah.
than having an autistic child
That's fucked up.
is insane.
Yeah.
It just literally doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah.
Like, and I do not have an autistic child, so like I do not know all of the struggles of parents of autistic children,
Yeah.
but would you rather they died of fucking measles?
Right. Yeah, like I'm not
Like, would
saying
you rather
that.
they die of the flu? Like, because that's what, when people tell me that their reason for not vaccinating their kids is that they're worried to get it, that they'll be autistic, like, that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, that's what
Like,
I hear too.
is that I'd rather my kid die or I'd rather somebody else's kid die because my kid got them sick.
Right. And like I was listening to NPR just yesterday and they were talking about how there's another measles outbreak and like people don't really know what to look for because it's not super common,
Right.
but it is becoming more common, which is unfortunate since it was eliminated at one point.
Mm-hmm.
But like what if it was polio or something, and then you have a kid whose legs don't work? Like, is that better? Even if they're
Right.
not dead, but they're still going to have like these long term conditions afterwards. Is that
Right.
better?
Right. Like, yeah.
And, a lot of the articles I was reading were like, people think that things weren't as bad because they don't recognize them. And they're like, oh, well, what did we do before we had a measles vaccine? How did we treat it? And it's like, we fucking died. A lot
Yeah,
of
we
people
died.
fucking died.
like that's what
what
happened, Bill. Like, people
That's why we
die.
have vaccines.
Yeah. That's
Like
why
I,
it's an important vaccine. That's why it's like required for schools. That's why like
That's what
it's
they were talking about too, is like whether or not we should force kids to get vaccinated. And like I think it was Florida, some state was like, oh, we're not going to require it. So you can choose to send your kids to school or not. And it's like the option is education or death. Like those are the
yeah.
options.
That wow.
Yeah.
Well, interesting to say the least. But a lot of clowns in this one.
I fucking know. I know. I can't believe that.
Not so much bumblers, just clowns.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, but actually, no. Andrew Wakefield is a bumbler. He bumbled. He bumbled too much. He's a bumbling clown, actually.
I like that. I like that idea that he's just a fucking clown. It sucks though because like people believe them.
I know. And a lot, it's honestly like, know several women from high school who are vehemently anti-vax, will not vaccinate, and they have like one of them has like 6 kids at this point.
God.
Like,
Well, you have
and
to have that many if you're not going to vaccinate them.
right, like, right. And so yeah,
Yeah.
it's scary out there.
It is. It's really scary. Please vaccinate your kids. There's no thimerosal in the vaccines anymore. Yeah, you can end up with side effects from vaccines, but like
The side
ultimately,
effects are not as bad as dying
no,
from measles or dying from the flu or getting like, even if you don't die, like you could get somebody else sick
yes, and that's
and
what
kill
people really
them.
don't
Like,
realize.
that's what people don't realize is like, well, I'm not going to die from the flu if I get it. And it's like, yeah, but you could cough on like my grandma at the grocery store
Right.
and she could die.
Right,
Like,
exactly. Like,
so,
it's the whole argument that people
and there
have
are
is like
people
not,
who literally can't get vaccinated
yeah, yeah.
for health reasons, like, and like you're putting them at risk.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's,
It's the same argument people were making for masks, where it's like, well, I have a right to not wear a mask. And it's like, you sure do, but kind of makes you an asshole when you're
yeah,
spreading a disease that's very easily to, tamped down.
yes.
Yes, so with that, there is our episode on Mercury. I am going to title it Thimerosal. It's a little clickbaity, but I have no regrets about it.
Nope. Well researched, Kayla. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please like, follow, subscribe, and review us everywhere you get your podcasts.
For more Lethal Dose content, you can find us at Lethal Dose Pod on Instagram, Tumblr, and TikTok.
For an overdose of content, subscribe on Patreon for exclusive episodes and much more.
The show theme is Look Far by our dear wizard friend Fogweaver. More of their music can be found on bandcamp.com.
Lethal Dose is created, researched, produced, and edited by Kayla Woods and Venus Daneko. Stay safe, and remember,
The dose makes the poison.